All right, fact check this. Tuesday night live streams are back, at least for the next 4 weeks while I don't have to work on Tuesday nights. And tonight I have a very special guest, David Brady. David, introduce yourself a little bit and kind of tell what you've got. I know you have your own show, The Road to Providence. And so tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we're going to get into the story that you were telling me before we got started, and going to have that kind of lead the show off.
All right. Hello, Justin. I'm glad to be here, first off. Who am I? I am just a young libertarian, a Mises Caucus libertarian who kind of hopped in to the liberty movement as best as I can. And then I just decided, hey, why not start a podcast? So I started my show, The Road to Providence, where I do a Sunday special where I interview people in more long form interviews where it's just about getting to know them. And then I also have my live show that I try to do whenever I can. It depends because, again, I'm balancing my education with doing a podcast and working because, I got to balance things. So I try to do the live show as much as possible. The Road to Providence, again, that's what I've got going on. I'm just a young libertarian with a podcast who likes to talk about economics and foreign policy. That's just who I am, I guess.
I mean, that's par for the course. If you're going to be a true libertarian, you have to have a podcast and talk about those things. So you are well on your way, if nothing else. So speaking of getting into that kind of stuff, and I did want to ask you before we really get into that, what is your educational situation like? Do you do a homeschool program or some sort of alternative type of program, or are you in a public school, private school, charter school? What is that? What does that look like? Because I know you do a lot of this kind of stuff pretty frequently. So
yeah, so I'm in a public school. Really, nothing fancy. I used to go to a charter school when I was between the ages of preschool and then third grade, which I think gave me a little bit of a boost above my peers and kind of set me a little bit on the path. Also, just having a good family that kind of valued me being able to read and such and got me interested. And I thank my grandma for that. But I go to a public school. I'm taking a lot of college classes though, and I'm just balancing being in public education with all of this stuff that I'm trying to do, which means that it's hectic and I lack a social life quite a bit of the time.
Again, par for the course for most libertarians. That's our social life is Twitter and whoever we can get to join us on our podcast. So you're not doing too bad.
Yeah, I think that's honestly kind of one of the really good things. When you look at people talking about there's too many libertarian podcasts or every libertarian has a podcast. Well, in the digital age where where you're trying to connect with people who have like-minded viewpoints as you, if you're doing it in a digital age and you're sharing those conversations, it's just that's essentially what these podcasts are. They're just people having conversations and you getting to listen to them. So I think it's just a really important and really great thing, really. People say too many libertarian podcasts. Well, every libertarian podcast is just a discussion and a conversation, which is an important thing, and we need to look at that and realize how much of a good thing that is. So I don't know. I don't think there's such a thing as too many libertarian podcasts. So.
See, I kind of agree with that. I do a Monday, Wednesday, and Friday morning show with a few friends of mine. And one of the topics that we had talked about a few weeks ago was there was this article that talked about people having trouble socializing during the COVID era and all of the pandemic and stuff. It's I feel like I've socialized possibly more. Number one, my actual personal friends, I've still talked to them and we still do stuff. And then on top of that, I've also met all of these crazy people online and do conversations like this on a regular basis. I mean, hell, the three other guys that I do the morning show with kind of stemmed out of just socially interacting with people on Twitter and getting to meet people. If people are struggling with social engagement in the modern era, especially in the Zoom and StreamYard era, that's on them. That's not a it's not a societal problem. It's a personal problem. The opportunities are wildly available for you to make new friends and be as social as you want to be, and even with the comfort of knowing that you could just hit the end button and be done with the conversation if you don't want to continue it. I feel like we are in a unique position here that we can make these sort of connections.
Oh, for sure. I don't think it like substitutes like a real in-person conversation. Of course, like go out, meet people, have conversations and things other than politics. Like, please. I realize that like I'm somebody who talks heavily about politics, and to the point where my family just tells me, David, be a normal kid. Stop it. Just shut up and be a normal kid. And I find like I have some of my favorite conversations are things that don't involve politics at all, whether it's just like bumming around with my friends, being like a guy, you know, or it's just like talking like about Marvel movies or something, because fitting, I like talking about economics and I'm also a nerd. Who would have thought, you know, that's those sort of conversations. It's important to have actual conversations. Yeah, I see. I see that for sure. And it's not as bad as Jose's from No Way Jose. I don't know. Somehow that man has a wife. I don't know.
And that's just one wall, is what I'll leave it at that.
All right. Well, I'll trust you that it's just that for now. But again, have those real conversations in real life. Certainly, you can't replace them with political conversations on a podcast. But again, podcasts, they can be really useful in like connecting with people who have similar viewpoints as you.
So taking it from there, let's talk about how you did sort of get into all of this craziness, because you were pretty young when you started paying attention, I would say. And honestly, you probably started paying attention about the time that a lot of people who otherwise didn't care about politics also started paying attention. And that was around 2016 or so. And I don't know what would have possibly been happening in the political landscape at that time that would get people interested, but why don't you kind of pick us up there around that time frame, and what were your thoughts on what was going on in the world and specifically in U.S. politics, and how did that kind of lead you down this path from there?
Oh Lord, well, I was a literal child then. I was like 12, like or something along those lines. 2016, you know, Trump versus Hillary. I was watching TV like every other kid does, and I'm seeing ads, and they're talking about like Trump is literally Hitler, and I'm just like, we can't have literally Hitler as president. And so I was like, Hillary Clinton is gonna win the election, and Trump will never be president. I was like George Clooney that one time. He's just like, Donald Trump will never be president, that we won't see a president Donald Trump, that sort of thing. I was totally that kid, which I probably shouldn't have been. I probably should have been a normal kid and totally not paying attention to any of that stuff. But I'm looking at all of this, and after the election, I realized the world didn't collapse immediately after, so I was like, what's going to go on now? And then I realized they lied about the Russia thing. So I was like, I hate the Democrats. So I kind of like hopped onto the Trump boat, mostly because I hated the Democrats above all things. And probably it's more like the enemy of the enemy is my friend. I don't know. I always kind of had like libertarian beliefs, kind of, maybe not like extreme, like Austrian economics stuff, but like, you know, leave people alone. Don't hurt people. Don't take their stuff. Don't be the worst. Don't be a decent individual. That was essentially my logic. And it pretty much just arose that I was just kind of like following along with Trump because I hated the Democrats and everything that they were whining and complaining about. I'm like, if it makes the Democrats angry, I'm going to root for that guy. But then eventually I get it. By some wild chance, I get introduced to the Fed. And I'm like, the Fed is the biggest issue. And apparently Trump was talking about that in 2016. I found some old clips. I was like, Trump has got to end the Fed. And I'm just all on the Trump train for a while. And then we get to like COVID, and I start really paying attention to politics because I'm angry at the people that have kind of taken away like 2 years of my life. I was angry at them, and I'm sure most people would be angry at them. And I was like, Trump let that happen. Trump didn't do the things that I would have wanted him to do. So I kind of like jumped ship, and I was kind of lost trying to figure out where I was going. And my dad was somebody who kind of like, sometimes he'd watch Part of the Problem, right? And so I'm watching Part of the Problem. I'm like, dang, he is right about everything. Holy crap. And so I'm watching all of this, and I get introduced to Michael Malice via Tim Pool, and that makes me hate the War Machine, because like the first time he was on Tim Pool, he was talking about how the media lies to get us into wars. That whole narrative. So I'm introduced to Michael Malice, Dave Smith. I realize these two are doing episodes together. This is amazing. And I'm like, who's this mutual friend of theirs, this very failed podcaster, Tom Woods? And then I delve further into it. And then just further through there, I dive further into libertarian stuff until the point where, like, a little bit after the 2020 election, I really hop onto, like, the Libertarian Party train and supporting, like, the Mises Caucus. And so I joined the caucus, and then I get on Twitter, and bon voyage, here I am now, somebody who enjoys economics probably way too much for my age group. So that's how I got here.
2016 was a lot of fun for me. So I'm one of those idiots who's a total stats junkie. So when a lot of these polls were coming out that were saying like 80% chance that Hillary was going to win, 90% chance Hillary was going to win, looking at all this polling data and being the dumbass junkie that I am for the stats, like I start digging into them and looking at these polls and looking at the way they're conducted and what their demographics are that they're pulling from. I'm like, these might be some of the most skewed polls you could possibly pull. Like, they completely ignore all of the demographics that would be Republican supporters or Trump supporters. Like, there's no way this is right. So I never expected that Trump would win, but I didn't think it was going to be what it was being painted as. Like, I thought there was going to be a lot more pushback, and I thought it was going to be a lot closer than what the polls were saying. And then when he won, then after that, then I really started looking at the numbers and the stats and digging into, like, where did it happen and why did it happen, and it was pretty insane. But you brought up a really good point, which is what we're going to talk about today, and that is the Fed. And I hit you with a few articles that we both can probably agree are just like the absolute worst possible articles to read if you want legitimate information about about inflation. But so let's start to dig into inflation a little bit. Why don't you give us the the Cliff Notes version of your findings and understanding of inflation and the Fed's role in that as you've kind of been figuring things out?
So inflation, to broadly describe inflation, it is the overall raising of prices based upon an increase in the monetary supply. This is because the amount of goods remains stagnant while the monetary supply increases. So, like, over the pandemic it's a perfect opportunity to explain it here. Goods aren't being made, but the Fed's printing money. Well, through a process far too complex to really go into right now that involves them buying treasury bonds and fractional reserve banking, where the Fed creates money. Essentially, they do create money by buying these bonds, putting it out into the market, and the money increasing over the same amount of goods means that the value of your dollar is worth less. It's simple supply and demand. If the supply goes up, the demand is going to go down for that dollar, right? So the increase of the monetary supply is what lends itself to inflation. And right now, we're dealing with inflation from when Trump was president. When he signed, 2 of the $2 trillion relief plans and all those bills, and the Fed was keeping interest rates near 0% because Trump was trying to save his economy after that bubble popped. So we're dealing with Trump's inflation. This means it's only going to get worse when you have people like Biden stepping in with more $2 trillion bills constantly being spent and no real way to pay for them because we're always running deficits and the Fed monetizes the debt. So right now, we're just dealing with we're dealing with the tip of the iceberg when it comes to inflation. And we're just going to keep dealing with more. And the government is not going to go and deal with it. Because if they were going to deal with it, it would result in a lot of people losing their jobs because they get voted out pretty quickly.
And that's probably well on its way anyway. But so something that you had kind of touched on there was talking about the fact that we did spend a decent portion of 2020 with nothing being made. So this CNN article, it doesn't do a completely terrible job of kind of getting some of the generic basics of inflation and at least to some degree why we've gotten here moderately correct. But I mean, the way their prescription for it is terrible. But it does talk about like how uh, in 2020 the automotive or the auto industry, for example, and this was so at the time I was working for a plastics company that primarily produced for auto manufacturers, and we saw them shutting down early on, like really really quick, right out the gate. Before like sweeping lockdowns were happening, they were starting to shut down and dial back orders. So this was happening in the auto industry, especially early on. Uh, so then but then what it talks about is how after all of these uh, stimulus, it wasn't the stimulus packages per se at that time, but they were giving the extra unemployment benefits and all of this stuff while people were being locked down, while people were being laid off. Uh, it drove the auto industry, especially used cars, just through the roof. And so then the automotive industries are having to turn around and start firing stuff back up after they had shut down. So it created this giant lag. And so some of what you're seeing, like yes, some of what you're seeing is market driven with the supply and demand side of things, but that's such a small percentage in the grand scale of the inflation that we're seeing. Like you said, like that's that tip of the iceberg. That's at this point in our modern economy, supply and demand is such a small portion of inflation and what's going on in prices going up that it's hard to with any level of reasonability prescribe that as an actual part of the problem. Does that sound pretty good, or is it relatively accurate? I mean,
yeah, that really does explain a lot of things, and like the used car thing really does kind of debunk like that Elizabeth Warren thing, like it's all corporate greed, when it's really like what corporation is selling old used cars? That's going to be your old junkers in the lots, and that's going to be small automotive dealerships. They don't got corporate greed, nor do they have a large enough market to be able to justify hiking up prices for absolutely no reason. So there's got to be clearly an issue here that's underlying there, besides like just this corporate greed you want to point to. And in a time when like profit margins are so thin, and I don't reasonably see it as just corporate greed, really. They don't make enough of a profit as it is, and with prices rising on everything, then it's gonna hurt everyone in the process.
See, that's an interesting thing coming from having some retail background. Like the amount of money that they make on the average retail sale, like the markup on that is not extravagant. And when you take into account insurance, loss, which loss is from theft, stuff getting broken, what have you, at the end of the day, the margin from purchase to sale is really kind of negligible. Like the reason that these companies are making these huge profits is not because of corporate greed. It's because the government shut down all their competition and funneled all of the business to them. Like it is a volume sale number, not a margin number. And which, I come from an agricultural background and a plastics background, and those are both the same way. Like you don't make a lot of money buying and selling grain. You don't make a lot of money selling plastic because your margins are so high. You make that money because of the volume that you turn over in the product. And it's the same way in the retail markets. Like they're not making money hand over fist on each individual sale. They're making those massive profits because they are generating sale on top of sale on top of sale. And it's all because the government shut down all of their competition and funneled all the business straight to them. But yeah, it's all corporate greed is the problem.
Oh yeah, definitely not at all the fact that the Fed has printed 40% of all dollars in circulation in the past 18 months. Not that at all. Not that at all.
And that's something that largely is not understood. Like the fact that for your age, you have a really good understanding of kind of how this works and the mechanics behind it and how it operates. Like, I would say most people my age don't even understand that. Like the general ignorance of how basic markets and monetary policy work in this country. It's truly a testament to a job well done by uh, public education to keep people dumb and keep people unaware of the truth of how their world actually operates, so that they don't get pissed off at the correct people for the problems. They get pissed off at billionaires who have literally nothing to do with how much money that you or I have.
Oh yeah, and then it's just this. It's because the government has this necessity to maintain this like Keynesian economic general theory, modern monetary theory. They need to keep that as what's going on. This Keynesian notion that if the government spends more and consumers are spending more, that's when the economy is doing good. When the GDP is high, not when like savings are high, not when the value of your dollar is going down. No, it has to be steady rising prices and constant spending. That's why they promote the Fed. That's why they don't tell you how the Fed actually works as far as like its open market operations. The FOMO. I think it's free the free open market operations. Yeah, FOMO. Those would be that's like the part of the Fed that has all of the power. They just print money, buy off treasury bonds from the member banks that are connected to it, and then they go and multiply that money via fractional reserve banking.
Well, and like the fact that their stated goal is 2% inflation every year. And that's what their stated goal is, but they don't really tell you what they're actually pumping out. They claim that right now we're around 6 or 7%, but a lot of the metrics would seem to indicate that it's probably closer to double that. And like for their 2% goal every year, if you go back and look year over year, a lot of the actual metrics and the data on that would show that it's probably double or triple that year over year. Like anything else that the government does, like they set their goals and they tell you what it is, and then they lie about it to make it seem like they're meeting their goals when they're actually nowhere even remotely close to it. That way they can continue to, or if there is a problem that they do admit to, it's what's the term they've used for inflation for a number of years?
Transitory inflation.
Transitory, yeah. And they can fix it. They just need more money so that they can fix it. They just need to print more money, and they need to keep the interest rates down. That way they can get it back under control, and they'll get it all worked out. Never mind that none of the things that they suggest to fix it are actually reasonably going to work towards fixing anything.
Yeah, and then you just look at the problem. Like, then there's these strange people who want to call themselves economists saying that if we spend $2 trillion more dollars, it's going to fix inflation. It'll actually bring inflation down. It'll save us money. It'll lower your prices. Putting $2 trillion more dollars out into the market without hiking up taxes.
What was the article why inflation is good?
Oh Lord. Well, that doesn't even like just an article that was put out, and they've been saying inflation is good for a long time. At least like a steady inflation is a good thing. Like, we haven't looked at the colonial or the Weimar mark. If we haven't looked at all those and realized that inflation is inherently bad, the Venezuelan dollar, I don't know what they call it down there. I don't know what their currency is, but those are all just blatant signs of inflation not being a good thing. but we're taught that the steady rising of prices and the increase in the monetary supply is good for Americans. We don't want dropping prices. We don't want your dollar gaining value while it sits in its savings account. We can't have that.
Oh, here we go. I found I found the one that I looked at back a while ago whenever it came up, when it first came out. Pull this up right quick. From our good friends over at CNN Business, why inflation can actually be good for everyday Americans and bad for rich people. See, as long as they spin it that it's bad for rich people, then average everyday Americans think that means it's good for them. And usually, whenever you do get into the metrics of it, it's never actually bad for rich people, because usually rich people have the means to weather whatever inflation happens to be. And it's the everyday Americans who actually can't, but they will spin it however they can to make it seem like it's bad for the rich people. So that means it's good for you.
Oh yeah, it's a total racket with this whole logic here, because like the vast majority of people who are rich, a lot of what their wealth is held in is assets. Assets just gain value because of inflation. They don't carry actual dollars. So all that inflation's gonna affect those like stock prices and all of those asset prices, all the gold, all of what they're holding is just gonna keep going up, because that's primarily what their wealth is held in. Not to mention that the vast majority of the connected wealthy class just gets these free handouts before inflation really sets in. So that way they get to spend the money and buy those assets before the money gets down to the rest of us and inflation has kicked in and has hurt our wallets.
Here's the beautiful example that they use for this article is they talk about the 30-year fixed mortgage and how inflation is actually good in that case, because you have your 30-year fixed mortgage, and that means your monthly rent or monthly mortgage payment stays the same month to month, while inflation means that your income is going up. So you're making more money, but your mortgage payment stays the same. Never mind that inflation has been driving the price of a house up so much over the last 20 to 30 years that the average person can't actually afford to buy one. Or once they do, then inflation going up all around you, your mortgage might be staying the same, but everything else around you is going up faster than what your wages are. And so now you can't afford to pay your mortgage because you're having to put that money towards just putting food on the table. And that's why, like it says, I think 11 trillion of America's 15 trillion in debt is made up in mortgages. Yet you have people like filing for bankruptcy and homes being foreclosed on at record rates. If inflation was really good for those people who have these mortgages, wouldn't people be paying off those mortgages, not going into bankruptcy and foreclosure?
Yeah, like the whole like logic of taking debt because that can be good for you when inflation hits really only applies if you are taking in massive amounts of debt and you are experiencing incredibly high, like hyperinflation to the point, like, you know, where you're at like the Weimar Germany levels at that point. You know, you have barrels of cash coming around. That's pretty much where that logic will apply. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to keep up enough with your rising prices. You've just taken in a bunch of debt, and the prices aren't going up enough for you to be able to keep paying that off, and it's not getting printed out of the way for you. You know, this logic doesn't really apply here, and it's just going to help the wealthy really, because again, assets maintain their value. The dollar doesn't. And most people are holding dollars, not assets, if they have savings at all. If they don't have savings, then you don't have anything at all to invest in to hedge against inflation. And those dollars that you're going to be getting, they're going to keep losing their value. They're going to be useless. That's why the dollar's lost 96% of its value since 1913.
I'm glad you brought up assets and like stuff like that. So I'm sure you've seen this. Kind of gets away from the inflation stuff, but it stays on the monetary policy and economic side of things. I'm sure you saw the thing where Elizabeth Warren very incorrectly said that Elon Musk didn't pay any taxes because and they make this claim fairly frequently when talking about the ultra rich, because a lot of them don't have a corporate salary. The entirety of their net wealth is accumulated in assets, in stocks, in what have you. So technically, Elizabeth Warren may have been correct. Elon Musk may not have paid anything in on his income tax because he does not take an income. All of his money all of his wealth is tied up in his investments and in his holdings, in his companies, in his actual assets that he owns. And when you look at that side of stuff, he paid more in taxes in 1 year than what you and me and Elizabeth Warren will combine for our entire lives. But so would you care to maybe touch on that side of things a little bit, like the disconnect between income from, say, a job versus like the way that a lot of these big corporations and their owners kind of take their salaries in the way of stock holdings and assets and stuff like that?
Oh yeah, well it's a perfect way of like hedging against inflation in that respect, because again, assets maintain their value. If your company is successful enough, like Tesla or SpaceX, those prices are just going to keep going up. And if you want that money, if you want actual access to money, since you're not taking a salary, you got to sell those and pay capital gains tax. That sort of logic here. He's still paying taxes. It's just not through the income tax because he's not getting a conventional salary in that respect. He's essentially hedging all of his profits and all that income that he could be taking in and hedging that into investing into his business. That's essentially how it's working. And then there's also like a further dishonesty here when you look at it. Like Elizabeth Warren, she also quoted him not paying any income tax from 2 years ago. 2 years ago is where she's quoting this. So I don't know, because like clearly this year he's going to pay a massive amount of taxes because he's going to be taking in some income, also paying capital gains tax on all of that Tesla stock that he sold. Because I know Bernie was being the worst, and he was just like on Twitter, he's like, "Hey, should I just sell some Tesla stock?" What a dude, what a man.
See, this was you had opened with or I had goaded you into opening with the stuff about Trump and 2016, and they talked about like Warren Buffett, Berkshire Hathaway, and like he had released his tax statements, and why wouldn't Trump release his tax statements? Well, Warren Buffett's the CEO of a massive corporation. Like he takes a huge annual salary. Plus, he has all of his stock holdings and everything else that he can claim and show. Whereas Trump is the sole owner of Trump Enterprises and all of the different assortment of things that are involved in that. Like his tax returns are not quite as simple and cut and dry, and they're not going to make sense to the average person who looks at them, because the average person who looks at them is literally only seeing a W-2. They don't understand how a private entity and the way that, like growing up on a farm, like the way farm taxes are done is if you can claim profit on some part of the farm, but then you can turn around and reinvest that profit back into the farm for other things. Being a private business owner, you have the ability to legally evade taxes by reinvesting into your own business. Warren Buffett does not have that option as the CEO of Berkshire Hathaway. Like that's not something that he can legally do and get away with it anyway. So like that always rubbed me the wrong way. How people would always try to compare those apples and oranges when it's not even remotely close. And that's the same way. That's the same stuff that you start seeing with Bezos and Elon Musk and some of these big multi-billionaires. Is the average person just has absolutely no understanding of how that side of the business world works in any way, and it's a shame, really. But I mean, that's the world we live in.
Yeah, and then they also use like the whole where they're not paying taxes as if it's something that I should look at and be upset with. I'm just like, teach us your secrets, Mr. Trump. Teach us how to not have to pay any taxes. His money's not going towards committing like war crimes in Yemen. I'll take it. I want to learn. I remember there was that they were at Romney said something about 47% of people don't pay any income tax, and then Ron Paul was just like, how do we get the other 53 to not have to pay any? It's the same logic here. I'm perfectly fine. If you're trying to convince me that they're a bad person because they're not paying any income tax, it has the reverse effect. If you're not paying income tax, I don't know. I'm more inclined to be a fan of you, that your money's not going towards a total war machine.
Yeah, I always kind of wonder what person is looking at that and saying, "Oh, they're not paying any income tax. That's terrible. They should be paying way more." Instead of looking at it and saying, "Oh, what's the secret here? How can I get out of paying mine too?" Like, I also don't like paying taxes. Maybe there's some trick that I'm not looking at, but for some reason that's not the way. At least nobody on the left. That's not the way any of them are. They're wired. They're not paying taxes. They need to pay triple taxes instead of they're not paying taxes. Maybe I shouldn't be paying taxes either. Man. Like let's have an equal playing field for everybody. Like nobody pays taxes. That's what I want to see.
Yeah, and then I see like they're constantly bringing up the fact that like Trump has lots of failed businesses. When I saw some wild conspiracy theory on Twitter, like how he invests like $1 million into these businesses, and then they intentionally go out of business because then he gets massive tax returns because they completely crashed and went to zero. And it's just I don't know. Maybe the man's a secret genius somehow. I'm not totally sure how this all adds up as far as like what happens when his business goes under. Not totally sure there, but maybe there's like some secret genius in him failing all of his businesses to scam the tax system.
I mean, when you're a multi-billionaire, you have the flexibility to take risks on some, like people have talked about his casinos that have failed. Casinos are not just some like money generating venture. Like a lot of casinos fail. That's not something that's new or unusual. So the fact that he had the money to invest into it and to take a gamble on something like that, anytime they would talk about all of his failed businesses, I'm like, yeah, when you're richer than God, you have that option. Like you can roll the dice on some questionable business ventures that if they pay off, you might make another 4 billion. And if they don't, you're out a few hundred million. And, you write that off on your tax as a business loss on the taxes, and you don't have to pay any taxes on it. And then you get to move on to something else. Like that's, if, don't hate the player, hate the game. Like if the game is set up in that manner, you play by the rules that are laid out for you. And like that's people who get mad because other people are better at playing by the rules is insane to me.
Yeah, it's like being upset at like Michael Jordan for being a good basketball player because you're not very good and you can't score any threes nor dunk because you're just that short. Sorry. It's like that same logic, being upset at them because they just are better at what they're doing here. They know how to play the game. They're more strategic than you, being mad at a chess player because they're able to defeat you. Same kind of logic here. People being needlessly upset that hey, they're doing better. I don't know. Like greed is an interesting thing when combined with like giving people actual power. But if as far as it's like greed and like a capitalist system, the way you earn money and benefit people is you provide a good or service and hope that people want it. Like, it's the best form of greed that I've got to say is around, you know. You can't, unless you're just some government monopoly and you claim the exclusive right to do something, or you're the only one who can provide a service, or you force someone at the end of a gun to do something, then otherwise you can't provide that. You can't force people to do that. They can choose. They have to choose to give you their money, you know, unlike the government, of course.
And see, I think that gets into an interesting thing, at least with the mindset of most of those on the left, is that they are mad that it's not a government entity that is providing that to everybody. And then nobody, and I guess in their opinion, nobody should be making money off of that. It should all be done as a public service to some extent, which if we haven't learned anything from COVID, it's the one thing that everybody should have figured out is that anytime the government tries to provide any level of a service, they're going to fuck it up royally. Pardon my French.
Hey, man, perfectly fine with me here. But, yeah, the government's incompetence is probably the most glaring thing to most normal people with COVID. And, like, if there's one way to really bridge the gap from being someone who's okay with the government and to somebody who absolutely hates it, it's what happened here. You know, they forcefully destroyed businesses. I mean, they propped them up and then they forcefully popped the bubble underneath your feet, tricking a lot of business owners. But it teaches you a lesson about trust in the government and their use of and behavior with the monetary system.
So let's kind of pivot back as we come in on the tail or the home stretch for this. Let's pivot back a little bit to inflation. What do you see or maybe think has the potential for being the solution, or what's the next step that the government might take that they claim as a solution?
So, as far as the government, as far as their response, that relies mostly on the Fed, and as well as like increasing taxes. It's not pretty, because as long as they keep monetizing the debt, you know, turning into U.S. Treasury bonds, the Fed buys Treasury bonds from banks, increases the monetary supply. As long as they keep monetizing the debt, we're going to only see inflation get worse and worse and worse. And it's gonna suck for a while. It's going to suck. Because right now, we just have more inflation coming down the barrel right now from low interest rates from the Fed and the endless money printing over COVID. That's all we're seeing. So if the Fed wants to fight it, then they need to raise interest rates first off. They need to raise them severely. And right now the system is drunk on easy money. Essentially, the Fed keeps liquoring up the economy, which distracts it from the actual problems that are wrong with the market. All this money's being invested in the projects that are unsustainable and that have no future. So if they raise interest rates even just a little bit, it's going to cause an economic crash again. It's going to put us further into the pits because we become so drunk. It's essentially like pouring a bucket of water onto the drunk. Same logic here. It's that crash. So if they want to really fight inflation, they need to massively crank up interest rates, you know, buying back those U.S. Treasury bonds to lower the monetary supply in the market, force banks to keep more in their reserves, loan out less, you know. Right now, bank reserves are at 0%. They don't have to keep – it used to be 10% for the longest time, but now it's 0%. They dropped that during COVID, like just before all of the lockdowns started. They put out a press release and they kind of hid it in the back. Bob Murphy talks about this in his lecture, Understanding Monetary Mechanics from the Mises Institute, that they dropped reserve rates to practically zero, to actually 0%, as in banks don't have to hold the money that they owe you. You know, Fed's the loaner of last resort in that case. So if they want to fight inflation, they need to stop monetizing the debt, which means they need to raise taxes. That's unpopular. Or they need to crank up interest rates to stop the inflow of credit into the system, which is also unpopular because it'll cause an automatic economic downturn. So the Fed said it's going to raise the interest rates like maybe 10 times by 0.25%, up to about 2.5% by the time probably 2024. That will cause an economic crash. So I doubt that the Fed's actually going to do it. They're not going to actually follow through on this. They're going to probably double down, and we're going to see probably the crack up boom that Rothbard predicted. As in, when they double down, hyperinflation ensues. The debt base, the national debt will become worthless because we'll reach Weimar Germany levels, and hyperinflation sets. We essentially default on everything because the dollar is now worthless. So I don't think there's a real solution that we're going to see from the federal government. If you, as a consumer, want to, that would be you'd want to find inflation hedges, which I'm not going to suggest any because, again, I'm not prepared to give financial advice, nor am I probably legally able to give financial advice.
It's interesting that you mentioned the very minute percentage that they're talking about raising interest rates and the number of times over the next I can't remember. Is it over the next 2 or 5 years? Nonetheless, like you said, it would create a significant economic downturn. And the biggest problem with that is even after they've made all of those interest rate raises or increases, they're probably halfway to where they need to be to actually fix anything. Like if even halfway to where they need to be to actually fix the problem that they've created over the last 30 years.
Hey, sorry, my earbuds aren't working real quick for a sec here, so I haven't been able to hear you for just that little span. I'm sorry. It's not connecting for some reason.
You're good.
Second here. Just see. Is it going to stay connected? Let's see here. Is that working now?
Okay, so what I had said was that even after they make all of these incremental increases in the interest rates over the next 2 to 5 years, however long it is, they're still only about halfway, if even halfway, to where they would need to be to make a realistic dent in turning inflation back. Like that's the minuscule amount of increase that those 10 incremental increases make doesn't even sway this at all. Like that's the big problem with their plan for correcting it.
Oh yeah, and if you look at it, even if they crank it up to 2.5% with inflation, like if we're just going to use the government's number of 7.5 and they crank it up to 2.5, that's still negative 5% essentially interest rates. So you're not going to be fighting any inflation. You're still going to be dealing with more inflation unless they massively crank up interest rates, which will destroy everything in its path. We're in a messy scenario.
Yeah, that's kind of the only solution. I guess the only solution that I see to the problem as it currently stands is you almost have to deliberately tank the entire system and maybe not even create a second recession. Like, might have to completely create a second depression and just to level things back out to a point that you can kind of start from scratch and try to get it right. Like, because you're not gonna turn it back over time. You don't have enough time to incrementally turn it back in the other direction, especially not with the national debt being what it is.
Oh, yeah, for sure. This isn't going to be pretty at all. And I hope that it happens during a Democrat president, some socialist or something. So that way we can blame it all on socialist policies. That would be great if we could just blame it on them. So I hope the recession or depression or whatever it is happens during them. And then they decide, and then they get voted out of office and we can put some laissez-faire candidate in there who will hopefully do nothing and let the market correct itself, because that was the biggest problem with the Great Depression of 1929 to 1945.
Yeah, hit on that real briefly. Explain what you mean by that was the biggest problem, because I know what you mean, but I want you to.
So the government intervention into this we need to let markets correct themselves, properly allocate resources to where they properly need to go for the correct supply of goods that Americans actually need and correctly are able to invest in. When the government steps in and interferes with that, it throws off the entire market. It demolishes everything it's doing. FDR's policies, some UCLA economists found that his policies increased the length of the Great Depression by an additional 7 years. Just all of his plans, that a lot of them were eventually struck down, and the Depression only ended because we massively deregulated the market following the World War II. And a lot of people will dispute that. They'll say, like, it's the Great Depression. We couldn't have fought that. Well, there's the one of 1920 that we did nothing for because Hoover didn't act. I think it was Hoover. He didn't act fast enough to respond to it. So the market was able to correct itself pretty quickly. And at the beginning, it had a deeper dip than the Great Depression. But since we did nothing, it corrected itself pretty quickly, and we got that nice boom afterwards when the Fed started lowering interest rates again. So then the Federal Reserve does all their policies again, Great Depression. And then we're supposed to take it as proof that the government intervention actually corrected all of this, when in reality, if it happened the other way, if government intervention had corrected it in about a year, and then we had done nothing, and the Great Depression had lasted an extra 7 years, what do you think they would be saying? They'd be saying government intervention would be the solution, right? Otherwise, looking at that, it's the reverse here. Non-intervention in the markets allows the market to correct itself. And FDR's policies were also total garbage because he was just demolishing goods and trying to inflate prices when people didn't have jobs.
Well, and then you saw the same thing in 2008, 2009 with the housing bubble popping and everything else, and the recession and everything that came out of that. Like, whenever that happened at the onset of it, I was like, okay, this is a good thing. This is a market correction that needs to happen. This is going to kind of level things, level the playing field, get everything back on an even keel, and then it can rebuild itself from here correctly. In steps the government, bails out. We have all the too big to fail bailouts, everything that comes out of that. And it sets us on the course that we've been on literally ever since. Like, everything kind of that we're seeing today is carryover from 2008, 2009, and all of the government overreaction to the recession and the housing bubble popping.
Yeah, and not to mention bankers just manipulating the entire population to not actually see the real problem. Like, you see Peter Schiff go down and talk to the Occupy Wall Street people, which, by the way, wonderful little video I've seen. Well, not little video. It's 2 hours long of him talking to these people. But it's a wonderful video. And he goes down and tries to explain how it's the Fed and how it's the government bailing out the banks, and it's them having power that's the problem. After that, you start seeing all the woke stuff enter everything, and soon, like the next year, you see J.P. Morgan with their gay pride float going down the streets of New York City in the same place where the Occupy Wall Street used to be. It's because the banks are distracting from all this crap. The Federal Reserve, they can invest in whatever it is they want because they essentially have they have an infinite amount of money. They can pay whatever propagandists they want, invest. They realize that all this woke stuff is a really good distraction from the actual problems, which is why Occupy Wall Street collapsed. And we're dealing with all this woke stuff because they're trying to cover up for the fact that they got bailed out and that they caused the bailout after the Tea Party folks started going down to talk to the Occupy Wall Street people.
Yeah, the Tea Party and the Occupy Wall Street folks, they were on the right track with certain things, but both movements sort of fizzled out for varying reasons. The Tea Party, I don't think, was super well organized or actually all that economically literate. They just saw what the problem was and knew that it was a problem. And then I think to some extent that was probably also the failing of the Occupy Wall Street types. They saw what the problem was and they knew what it was, just didn't have a good solution for it. So what we need is more people like you who are young and understand how this stuff works, and not only who see what the problem is, but kind of understand what the legitimate solutions are, and maybe have a plan as we move forward in the future to get us out of that rut. Because I'm pretty well giving up hope on my generation. I think we're all a bunch of morons. with the exception of the handful that I talk to regularly on Twitter.
Hey, I would have more hope. I don't know. Looking at it, Trump doesn't have a solution to inflation if he were to come back into office. Biden certainly doesn't have a solution. You can see he's just planning to do the exact opposite and double down on all of his problems, especially with the gas tax holiday, which unless you suspend the gas tax for all time, it's just going to make problems worse. But that gives us a really good opportunity to step in and time to be really hopeful because we have the solutions. We actually can point to what the real problem is, and it's the government, and the Federal Reserve doing all of this nonsense. We can look to the actual problem. We can point that out and offer a real solution. So I think we should be hopeful that we actually have the solutions and people have to start listening to us. Like whether it's through like the Libertarian Party, like I would like to choose, or if it's through like Tho Bishop getting on Steve Bannon's War Room and such and getting to talk about all of that stuff and make it so that the populist right knows what the solutions are. All of these are good steps. Trump doesn't actually have a solution right now unless he embraces something like what is a libertarian position, unless he actually adopts that. I don't know. I think we should be hopeful. And I've been preaching about the Federal Reserve since I learned about it, man. I have been preaching about it. Like I'm taking a college world history course, American history course. And whenever I get the chance to talk about economic recessions, I'm always like, it's because of fractional reserve banking or poor monetary policy, or it's a central bank. And I don't know, I'm trying to get it through the heads of all of my peers. The Fed is the problem. So I'm trying my best as far as that goes.
Well, more power to you. Hopefully you can actually make some inroads with some of your peers, and hopefully some of my peers will listen to this as well and get a little better understanding and start to maybe pay attention to some of that stuff and figure out where the problems are coming from. David, give all your plugs and then we'll call this a wrap.
Alrighty. Well, you can find me on Twitter. It's listed right there on my little picture there. You can follow it there rather than trying to explain and spell it out there. My link tree is in my bio. Hi, Sophia. I have my link tree in my Twitter bio. You can find all my stuff there. I have the YouTube channel, The Road to Providence. Same thing on Odyssey. You can find it all there. If you want to support on Odyssey, be sure to follow. So that way I can actually get that follower count up. And that way, in case I have a guest on that gets me banned somehow, I don't know. It's just how it works here. So I got YouTube. I got Odyssey. You can find me there. You can also find me on Twitter, like right there. That's my handle. Also, Gab. You can also find me there because I don't know. I got on there at some point. I don't know. It seems like it's more free speech than like Parler or whatever the Truth Social thing is. So you can find me there. But those are my plugs. Yeah.
Well, David, thank you very much. This has been very fun, and it's really cool to talk to somebody who knows so much at such a young age. Like I keep coming back to it, I know, but like we were talking about before the show, like my son's 13. He knows pretty much whatever he knows from listening to podcasts sitting in my office with me, and definitely doesn't take the time to read and research and study stuff in depth. So hopefully and honestly, I do have hope because I do know that there are a lot more like you out there. Like, so that is a little bit of a white pill for the future. Maybe hope is not entirely lost, and your generation will lead us out of the shit show that mine is kind of allowed to continue.
Yeah, it's just be hopeful, people. Being like black-pilled and being pessimistic about everything, not going to get you anywhere. It's only through like being hopeful that we are going to win because, the good guys win. Every story goes like that. The good guys win. You have to be optimistic. We're going to win. It might hurt. It might be difficult, but we're going to win in the long term. So be hopeful. We're going to win. End the Fed, Check out Mises.org or something.
Absolutely check out Mises.org. And in the meantime, I hope everybody has a great rest of your day, a great rest of your week, and I will be back on Monday with a brand new episode that I talk about something. Actually, I've got a couple ideas for Monday's topic, so I'll see which one of them I end up running with. And then we will be back next Tuesday with another Tuesday night live stream. And I had a good topic for that I wrote down because I knew I would forget it. And I've got a couple guests I got to ask about coming on for that one because I've got, I think I'm going to have some fun with these Tuesday night live streams. Join us again next Tuesday, 7:30 p.m. Central. And until then, hope everybody has a great one. Catch you later.